When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: Vermilion. User: MissingX16. Posted April 3rd, 1996.
My mother was the painter Andy Brundage. If you've never heard the name before, it's because her entire catalog was purchased by a private collector from Argentina shortly before her death in 1975. The deal was brokered through an intermediary, so I never knew the buyer's name and only heard his voice once. All I knew for sure was that it was a man who spent years buying up pieces of Mom's work from museums and other private owners before approaching me to take possession of the remainder. By that point, Mom was in the final stages of dementia that had appeared only 2 years before and progressed at a rate that doctors had previously thought impossible. Mom's art was challenging, you might say, so she didn't see a lot of mainstream success, but the people who got her work were obsessed by it. Mom's obsession was the color vermilion, a bright red-orange tone that dominated everything she painted. She'd create landscapes that stretched out to the horizon, filled with deformed foliage and creatures that have no obvious analog in the real world. Above it all stretched a vermilion sky, and everything beneath was tinged by its light. Mom's name for this place was Black Candle, and she knew it so well she could describe it like she was reading from Frommer's. Her capacity for imagination was such that if she had been a novelist instead of a painter, J.R.R. Tolkien would have been given a run for his money. When I say that people were obsessed with Mom's work, I should clarify that they were obsessed with Black Candle. We would get letters from people across the country demanding to know how it was Mom was painting their dreams. One man sent an entire dream journal which, if it was real, described night after night spent wandering the fields of Black Candle, hiding from things which only existed in my mother's paintings and his imagination. In fact, I found the journal shortly before the sale took place, and the descriptions were so vivid, I had to put it down. As I said, the people for whom Mom's work clicked were obsessive. Even so, the amount the stranger offered for her remaining paintings and sketches was borderline obscene. I took it, of course, but it caught me completely by surprise. Once the paperwork was signed, a group of movers in black coveralls led by a slender lawyer named Gordon were there within 12 hours to take possession of her collection. Gordon was an unusual man, neatly dressed with round eyeglasses, his remaining wisps of hair combed flat against his skull. He spoke in a gentle voice, telling me who he was and that after everything was loaded, his employer would like a brief word with me. Sure enough, once the men, who looked like linebackers and never spoke a single word the entire time, were finished, the phone rang. I picked up the receiver. Hello. The man at the other end spoke barely accented English, though I never did discern exactly what that accent was. Mr. Brundage, he said, is that you? It is. You're the buyer, I assume? I am indeed. May I ask your name? I said. You're paying me quite a lot of money, and I don't even know who to thank. It is I who should be thanking you, Mr. Brundage. The evasion was so subtle I didn't catch it at first. As my intermediaries have no doubt informed you, I've been pursuing this collection for the better part of 20 years. It's difficult to describe the enormity of this moment for me. If I may, what is your mother's condition? I'm given to understand she is afflicted. I let out a breath. That's correct. She has dementia. It's not the sort of thing that improves. Of course, my condolences, Mr. Brundage. The terms of our agreement should allow her as much comfort as she is capable of experiencing. She was a singular talent and deserves nothing less. Thank you, I said, Mr. I realized he'd never given me a name. He cut me off. Mr. Brundage, there's a critical piece of your mother's ephemera that I'm desperate to ensure is among the items my men have removed. It is a handwritten journal sent to her by a young man sometime in the early 1950s. Oh, I said, I know the journal you mean. In fact, I stumbled across it a few days ago, but didn't include it in the boxes because it wasn't something she wrote. You want that too? Oh yes, he said, almost wolfishly. And you are absolutely right. It was not of your mother's creation and thus not part of our arrangement. An oversight on my part, certainly. Would you accept $250,000 for it? My jaw dropped. That was a third of what he'd paid for the entire collection. I stumbled over my words, eventually getting out what I hoped sounded like an agreement. When he spoke again, it sounded like he was smiling. Excellent. Please hand the phone to Mr. Gordon, and I shall make the arrangements. I looked over at Gordon, who was watching me intently. He wants to speak to you. Gordon nodded and took the receiver from my hand, listened for a moment before saying yes, sir, and handing it back. He then briskly walked out the front door. Mr. Brundage, are you there? Came the voice from the other end of the line. I shook my head in an attempt to clear it, then put the telephone back to my ear. I'm here. Look, I understand if you don't want to tell me your name, that's your business, but what is it about my mother's work that speaks to you so much? I know her fans can be obsessive, but paying $250,000 for someone else's fictional exploration of it is something else entirely. There was silence for a moment, then the voice spoke again. Where I come from, Mr. Brundage, there's a parable. It was not written in English, but the story it tells is this. A man living alone answers a knock at the door. When he opens it, he sees in the doorway the powerful body, the cruel face of the tyrant. The tyrant asks, "Will you submit?" The man does not reply. He steps aside. The tyrant enters and establishes himself in the man's house. The man serves him for years. Then the tyrant becomes sick from food poisoning. He dies. The man wraps the body, opens the door, gets rid of the body, comes back to his house, closes the door behind him, and says firmly, "No." We are under the tyrant's boot now, Mr. Brundage, but I believe within your mother's world, within Black Candle, there exists its poison. We need only the map and directions. I now have both. Something sour started to bloom in my stomach. I don't mean to be insulting, sir, but you are aware Black Candle doesn't really exist. It's like Middle Earth or John Carter's Mars, a place of fantasy. The man's reply was quick, far more so than anything he had said to this point. Of course, naturally, I'm speaking in the figurative sense. As I said, your mother was a singular talent. My agent, Mr. Gordon, has gone to effect a wire transfer for the additional sum. It should be in your account by tomorrow, midday at the latest. He'll return as soon as possible to take possession of the journal personally. I ask that you remain at home until he does. Of course, that's not a problem. Thank you, Mr. Brundage. Oh, and Mr. Brundage, one final question. Speaking of singular, your name is relatively unique. Are you by chance related to one Avery Brundage? No, sir, I don't think so. The name comes from my father's side, and he was an only child, to the best of my knowledge. The man made a noise that sounded vaguely disappointed. Pity, he said. Although perhaps that would have been asking too much. Very well, Mr. Brundage. Thank you again. Good day. There was a click, and the man was gone.
Subject: The Floresville Miracle. User: 6glowtx. Posted June 1st, 1999.
What does it say about a miracle if no one remembers it? Was it a mistake? What if one person holds on to the memory? Does it mean God forgot about them? Or was the miracle meant to tell them something? I've asked myself these questions almost every day since September 26, 1953, and still don't have an answer. It seems blasphemous to think God and all His glory would do something just for me, but how else to explain that of the thousands of people to see the Floresville miracle, I'm the only one who hasn't forgotten? Nowadays, when people talk about miraculous events in Wilson County in 1953, they're talking about the rains that saved our peanut crop from what had been months of drought. That was a gift, to be sure, because it meant economic life or death for our town, but drought wasn't exactly uncommon in Texas in those days, or ever, and it's not what I'm talking about. I haven't lived in Floresville in many years, but I fondly remember the Peanut Festival. It always happened in late September and meant we'd get an extra day off school the Friday, so us kids got to be a part of the big, mile-long parade. That year, it all kicked off with a ceremony where Mr. Ford, the owner of the newspaper, gave a big Texas hat to the head of the National Peanut Council who'd come down from Washington. I was a small, wiry kid who was good at working his way to the front of the crowd, so I got to see the government man try to accept the hat graciously, even though he looked like a horse's ass and we all knew it. The rest of that first day is a blur, the way most childhood memories are. I remember downtown Floresville wreathed in green peanut vines, the Arcadia Theater showing a free picture all day, and the rich fragrance of peanut oil drifting over it all. In the evening, we watched our Tigers beat the Karn City Badgers on the back of Johnny Sims rushing 200 yards. People used to say Johnny would have gone pro if he hadn't liked drinking so much. He ended up tending bar at Lucy's place till the night he was driving home with a skin full of booze and plowed straight into a cow that had found its way onto the road. The next day's festivities were centered around the new gym at the high school with square dancers, a model airplane show, and what all. The square dancers had come from San Antonio, and boy could they move, each of them in perfect precision, like clockwork, the women's gingham dresses whirling. As the sun made its way to the horizon, revelry gave way to ceremony, and it was announced that the king and queen of the festival would be crowned. I don't recall who the king was, no one ever did. Kings, even minor ones like at the Floresville Peanut Festival, were all forgotten or despised, but a queen lives forever in your heart. That year, our queen was Betty Jean Blake, Dr. and Mrs. Blake's daughter, and she was a vision, the prettiest girl my 8-year-old eyes had ever seen. She wore a long white dress embroidered with golden accents, and even in the soft light of the gymnasium, glowed like a star in the sky. The crowd, which had to be more than 1,000 people, hushed right down as Miss Betty made her way to the stage. Even Mr. Panabaker, the master of ceremonies, lost himself a bit and mumbled his words at the start of his speech, but I don't think anyone really noticed. The crown had just about touched Mrs. Betty's head when the commotion started. The first thing I noticed was the hair on my arm standing up, followed by a deep vibration in my chest. I never felt anything like it, and I don't mind telling you, it scared me. A second or two later, I started hearing people around me talking about feeling funny, and I looked back to see a lot of hands clutching chests or mopping brows. Next, the ground started rumbling, and I felt the bleachers where we were sitting sway a little, like a big freight train was passing by. Only problem with that was, we weren't anywhere near a rail line. Folks started to panic, and Mr. Painbreaker tried to get it under control, telling the crowd to file calmly outside. It's a measure of Floresville's character that everyone did as they were told, give or take some people who had gotten themselves so worked up at the idea of a commie attack that they couldn't do much apart from wringing their hands. 1,000 people spilled out into the schoolyard where the scheduled street dance led by the Texas Plainsmen had been in full swing before the rumbling began. Again, given the sheer volume of people, you'd expect some manner of calamity, but most everyone conducted themselves with the grace and calm you'd expect of Texans under duress. As the gathered crowd tried to make sense of what they were experiencing, I heard everything from tornado weather to earthquake to more of the red plot kind of stuff. I found myself looking upward to a point of light high in the sky above the football field. At first, it was one point of thousands in the night sky, so I don't know exactly how I came to fixate on it, but it soon grew from a pinprick to a softball that glowed even more than Miss Betty had. One by one, the others noticed it too, until everyone there was gazing upward, watching a ball of light expand as it got closer to us till it was bigger than the Wiseman house over on 3rd Street. The orb slowed as it got within feet of the football field, shining so brightly you could scarcely look at it. We all, to a man, used our hands to shade our eyes while still trying to see what exactly had touched down in our little town. Its surface was glassy but rippled like it was always moving. Within that outer shell was the light itself, a brilliant, pure white, pulsating to a rhythm we couldn't hear or feel. When the liquid glass exterior of the orb touched down onto the grass of the football field, the rumbling stopped, and in its place, a quiet fell. My parents looked at one another, unsure of what was expected of them, and I could see many others going through the same experience. As for me, I felt an internal peace, unlike any I'd known before or have felt since. A calm that allowed me to hear a voice. Well, not a voice exactly, but in my heart, I knew that this strange, beautiful creature was speaking to me. It told me to come closer. It wasn't hard to slide through the crowd of onlookers, each of them frozen in a mix of fear, confusion, and awe. I remember their clothes brushing over my skin as I squeezed past, as if each person was giving me a secret blessing. In just a few moments, I had pushed my way to the front of the crowd at the edge of the football field, less than 100 feet away from the visitor. The pulses of its inner light were steady now, almost matching the beat of my heart. The closer I got, the more sure I was that I needed to make contact, to touch it and connect my world with whatever one it had come from, be it heaven or Krypton. There were murmurs from the crowd behind me as I stepped further into the field, but no one made a move to stop me. Strangely, with each step nearer to the light, it became more bearable, and I had to protect my eyes less. Once I was within arm's reach of its surface, I didn't need to shade myself at all and could see not just through the light, but inside it to what it truly was. There are no words in any language I know to fully describe what I saw that night. The scope of it was bigger than my 8-year-old brain, or my present one, come to think. The ball was both living and not, a sentient thing that also acted as a doorway between here and places you can't imagine. Through its heart, I gazed into infinity, where a million possible worlds intersected and wrapped around each other, an endlessly faceted diamond that had no beginning and no end. I felt both total awe at the beauty of its elegance and terror at how insignificant I felt in the face of it all. With a sound like breaking glass, the vision ended. I became aware I was crying. The ground began to rumble again as the orb began its ascent, static electricity tugging at my body. Higher and higher it rose until finally it disappeared into the sky, into the everywhere and nowhere it had shown me. I wiped the tears from my face and turned back to the crowd, only to realize they weren't there. Somehow, without me ever noticing it, the entire town had disassembled and gone, leaving me there with that strange emissary from another world. When I got home, my father was reading Friday's paper and my mother was listening to the radio. Neither of them asked where I'd been or expressed a single shred of interest in the extraordinary events to which we'd all been witness. When I pressed them on it, they professed ignorance and said they'd enjoyed the coronation very much, but decided to skip the dance as they'd been up late the night before. In the days to come, I would hear this story repeated over and over. There wasn't a single resident of Floresville I spoke to who had any memory of what had happened, but they all insisted they'd had a lovely time. The part of me that was still an 8-year-old boy wanted to believe he was the subject of a cruel prank on the part of the whole town, but deep inside, I knew that wasn't it. Seeing into the light had forced a kind of maturity on me, and I couldn't hold on to any childish notion for long. I just wish I knew what I traded that childhood away for.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.